I think what we have found is that the benefits of connection and the hazards of loneliness and disconnection are so powerful that the reason why we're excited about it is we feel like we really want to bring this message to people.
Hello, and welcome to the Psychology Podcast. Today's episode is sponsored by Unlikely Collaborators. Their mission is to untangle the stories that hold us back as individuals, communities, nations, and humanity at large. Using the perception box lens, they do this through storytelling, experiences, impact, investments, and scientific research. Unlikely Collaborators, the only way forward is inward. Today we welcome Robert Waldinger to the podcast. Robert is a psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, and Zen priest. He is Professor of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and Massachusetts General Hospital, where he directs the Harvard Study of Adult Development. His TEDx talk on this subject has received nearly 44 million views and is the 9th most watched TED Talk of all time. He is the co-author of The Good Life with Dr. Marc Schulz. In this episode, I talked to Robert Waldinger about the secret to a happy life. Robert shares with us the recent findings of the GRAND study, which is the longest scientific study of happiness ever conducted. It's been ongoing for more than 80 years now and has had high-profile participants like U.S. President John F. Kennedy. In this episode, Robert and I get into the details of how they continue to conduct research and how to make sense of both the new and old data. Sure enough, what the study has found consistent is the power of connection. We also touch on the topics of psychodynamic therapy, defense mechanisms, attachment, and psychological research and its methodologies. This was a really awesome chat with someone who has led this legendary study. We call this episode The Secret to Happiness, but there's actually a bunch of secrets, and I don't want to spoil it for you. I want some of the secrets to be a surprise for you. So without further ado, I bring you Dr. Robert Waldinger. Hey, thanks for being on the Psychology Podcast today. How you doing?
Well, I'm doing fine. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I am a great admirer of the work you've done and the research you're continuing to do. Can you kind of start with telling our audience a little bit about how you got into the position you currently have and what your background is?
Sure. I am a psychiatrist. I'm a Jew who grew up in Des Moines, Iowa, and
Nice.
never knew any psychiatrists growing up, and realized in medical school that psychiatry was the most interesting thing I had found. And so I trained actually as a psychoanalyst. And so my specialty clinically is talk therapy. And then I wanted to learn to do research. And so I retooled in my 40s. I went back and took statistics courses and did a bunch of things and got the wherewithal to do number crunching kind of research. And at that point, the third director of the study that I now direct, George Valiant, took me out to lunch one day and said, "How would you like to inherit this study?" Wow. So that's how I got here 20 years ago.
I mean, that's incredible that he did that. Is George still alive?
He is.
Good, because I've been planning on meeting him. I think he's in San Francisco. So I've been planning on meeting him for lunch.
He's in the LA area.
I just don't want to put that off too much longer. Yeah. Oh, is he in the LA area now? Okay, I definitely need to reach out to him. So I'm a big George Violent fan, and Viallant. How do you pronounce his last name?
He pronounces it Valiant.
I always notice that, but there's no extra I in there.
I know.
That always confuses me. But anyway, okay. Anyway, George is such a legend, and I'm a big fan of his work on defense mechanisms. And he's, I know you emphasize connections, but I feel like when he was running that show, he was emphasizing how certain defense mechanisms can really carry us through life, and the way that we cope with adversity and the way we cope with things. So I'm wondering, how much are you interested in the stuff that that George studied?
I'm very interested. So as a psychoanalyst, I'm quite interested in defense mechanisms and how defense mechanisms really serve us pretty well, what George referred to as the more mature defense mechanism. And some defense mechanisms don't work well at all. And we see that play out in people's lives in our study.
Okay. So let's talk about the study. What a whopper doozy this one is. What is I'm still not so sure on the methodology of it. I'd love to know more about this mysterious methodology that you use to like, what are you measuring? How do you measure it? Do you rely on self-reports? Basically, this is the nerdy psychology podcast, so I want you to feel really comfortable talking about the details with me on the show. I'm a fellow psychologist.
Great. Do you want me to explain the setup of the study?
Yeah, if you could please explain the setup, and then, what are some of the main measures that you've been tracking all these years?
Sure. So the study was started in 1938, and it was started with actually as two studies that didn't know about each other. One was a group of 268 Harvard College sophomores, 19-year-olds. And they were gathered together for a study of normal young adult development from adolescence to early adulthood. So of course, if you want to study normal development, you study all white men from Harvard, right? It's like so politically incorrect, but that's what they did at the time. And then the other study was started at Harvard Law School by a law professor named Sheldon Gluck and his wife, Eleanor Gluck, who was a social worker. They were interested in juvenile delinquency, and they were particularly interested in how some kids born into really troubled and disadvantaged families managed to stay on good developmental paths. So both groups were studies of thriving, but one very privileged, one very underprivileged. And then, later on we brought in spouses. Now we've brought in the children. So we have good gender balance now in the study, but it was originally all boys and young men.
That is so interesting, and seemingly very disparate life experiences. Seemingly. Yeah. I guess it's possible that there were Harvard students who grew up in poverty, and maybe were there any like overlap?
Well, there was a little, not so much poverty, but some of these guys were on scholarship. Half of the young men had to work to pay at least part of their way through college. So they weren't all rich kids. Harvard was by then trying to bring in people who were not wealthy, but most of them were much more advantaged than the inner city. So there wasn't that much overlap. And the inner city sample was not just poor kids, but kids from families that were known on average to 5 social service agencies for things like domestic violence, severe parental mental illness, physical illness, very extreme poverty, those kinds of things. And then you had asked, so what's the methodology? What did we study? And we really have studied the big domains of life. So they are mental health, physical health, work life, including work satisfaction and who gets promoted, who gets fired, and relationships. And then for the Harvard men, they were all of the age to go to World War II and almost all served in the war. The inner city men were on average 9 years younger, so they were not old enough to go to the war. But we studied World War II experiences as well.
Any of them still alive?
Yeah.
Wow. They must be old.
They're really old. They're all in their either late 90s or early 100s, and only about 40 out of 724 total.
It's still amazing that 40 still exist. That's still amazing. I mean, this is the biggest parallel of your study that I am aware of is one that I talk about a lot, which is E. Paul Torrance's creativity study. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but if you're not, I'd love to teach you everything about it, because he initiated that in the 50s, and they have been still following up. And they still release the reports on what were the biggest predictors of creativity. So you're focusing on happiness, so you're focusing on well-being. E. Paul Torrance asked a very similar question, which is who naturally grows up to be the most creative. Were there any metrics of creative productivity in your study?
There weren't. I mean, so we have, of course, metrics of income. We know how much everybody made, at regular intervals. We know about job promotions. We know about professions, but we really never studied that question of, who's more creative, who's less creative.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to teach you all about the Paul Torrance study and what they found, but obviously we're shining a spotlight on your amazing study today. So in terms of happiness, I mean, as you acknowledge in the book, which I love, happiness is messy. It's not just feeling good. So when you look at, I assume that you attack this issue from multiple different things that you triangulate to try to figure out, if they're happy someday in life. What are some of the main things that you try to triangulate? Because you say in your book, quote, "The good life is a complicated life." You said that. You said that.
I stand by it. It is.
I know. Well, I stand by it too. I stand by your quote.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Well, so, what we did, I mean, we're kind of a textbook case in the history of science. So we've studied the same things for 85 years, but we bring in different methods as different methods come online. So we started out with regular questionnaires, surveys. And we did, the original founders of the study did interviews and detailed physical exams. And then every few years, we'd send them a questionnaire, every 2 years, actually. And we got their medical records from their doctors. But then we began to audio tape them, and then we began to videotape them. And now we draw blood for DNA and messenger RNA, and we put people into the MRI scanner and scan their brains. I mean, and we deliberately bring them into our lab and stress them out and then watch how they recover from stress.
Don't stress these 100-year-olds out too much, my friend.
Well, we actually brought in the kids and stressed them out.
Okay, I got you.
We're all kind of baby boomers. So what we do is we bring in these different methods to try to look at well-being through different lenses.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
The originators of the study would never in a million years have imagined, A, that the study was still going on, and B, that that such methods would even exist. Exactly. Imagine going to 1938 and showing them an fMRI machine.
Exactly.
We're looking in your brain.
Or DNA,
Yeah, or DNA. Well, isn't that you think about how much science, it's a whole other topic, but I'm fascinated with the history of science and even just the past 70 years, what we've gone from a kind of a pre-scientific world to a ultra-scientific world. Anyway, it's so fascinating. Well, what a wonderful data set to inherit, so to speak.
What a gift.
That you can play around with that. Nerds like us can just jump in that, and so you're looking at lots of correlations. It seems like in terms of causative claims, you're a little bit more limited there. But what can you still say? I mean, it is a longitudinal study, so that's beautiful. That does make it possible to make some, but you don't have a good control group. That's my concern. So
right,
yeah,
no, it's a really good concern. It's an important question. What do we? So unless you do a tightly controlled experiment, you can't prove causation. Right. And we can't tightly control it and say, okay, we're going to traumatize these children and we're going to not traumatize these children. And then we're going to see how their lives play out. That's unethical, right? It's unethical to do most kinds of experiments on human beings. Absolutely. So what we do, as you're mentioning, is we follow people along and we don't prove causation, but what we can get closer to is that kind of chicken and egg question. Which comes first? And that's very helpful. So I'll give you an example. Quite a number of people in our study had the combination of depression and alcoholism. And when you ask people who have those problems, which came first, the alcohol or the depression, they will always tell you, oh, I got depressed and then I started to drink. But when you actually look, and we followed them, the drinking comes first, and then depression. So it's that kind of question that we can shed some light on by following people year after year over a lot of time.
That's true. That's true. But a lot of things came before their depression as well. Just to play devil's advocate.
Absolutely.
Not
Right.
just you could have said you can't make the same inference about like, oh, they got divorced before the depression, you know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So what we do, and this is where, to your point, we make sure that other studies have found the same things or are pointing in the same direction. So we never claim our study alone has found it, and so you have to believe it.
Yeah.
Because of this problem, that there needs to be replication of scientific findings for us to have confidence that those findings are not just by chance.
I gotcha. That's a good scientist in you. Today's podcast is sponsored by Unlikely Collaborators. Their mission is to untangle the stories that hold us back as individuals, communities, nations, and humanity at large. Using the perception box lens, they do this through storytelling, experiences, impact, investments, and scientific research. Today's conversation with Robert really illustrates the importance of expanding the walls of our perception box. The perception box is the invisible mental box that we all live inside, and it can seriously hinder our ability to understand one another and to understand ourselves. In this episode, Robert reveals the main lessons he has learned from the longest ever study on human happiness. One of the major lessons is the importance of cultivating human connections for being able to weather the storms of life and to live a full, happy existence. This lesson is very much tied to our perception box. When our perception box walls are contracted, we see the world in a very narrow way, thanks to our own stories and self-judgments. These stories and self-judgments limit our potential to form deep connections with others. This is especially the case when we perceive someone as being very different from us, or we don't immediately feel a connection with a person. When we consciously and deliberately make the effort to see outside ourselves and our stories, at least temporarily, the walls of our perception box expand and we're able to encounter another human being with curiosity and openness. This can help us cultivate the most unlikely connections and can lead to some of the happiest moments in our lives. To find out more about Unlikely Collaborators and the perception box, go to unlikelycollaborators.com. You said you're a psychoanalyst by training. That is so interesting because I don't feel like psychoanalysts get much love these days, especially in psychology. Field. No. In the psychology field, we've like moved on. We're CBT, we're ACT, we're they're all the acronyms, all the things. Do you feel like Freud is overrated or underrated?
I think Freud is both. Some people overrate him, very few actually, but many people underrate him. So yeah, in psychology now, Freud is thought of as like old school, almost witchcraft, because he had some ideas that were really wrong, right? But he had so many fundamental ideas that were so right that now we forget they were largely made popular by Freud. So CBT was founded by a psychoanalyst. Aaron Beck was an analyst.
Yeah.
That there are many, and there's a great talk. I can't remember his name. He's a psychology professor at Yale, but he gives a talk to his undergraduate students saying, you're going to hear that Freud is totally outdated, not useful at all. But let me just walk you through all these concepts that we couldn't live without in psychology because of Freud. So I would say mostly he's underrated because we forget that a lot of what everything is based on had to do with Freud.
Absolutely. I think you're referring to Paul Bloom, by the way, at Yale.
Oh, is it? I don't remember. I loved his talk, whoever he was.
I think. Don't quote me on that, but it sounds like something Paul would say. Well, first of all, so that's cool, but also let's give some love to Anna Freud.
Yeah.
Anna Freud. That's talking about defense mechanisms. I think Anna did more than what Sigmund did. Yeah. And so let's give some love there. And also, I am anyone who knows me knows I'm such a big fan of Karen Horney.
Oh yeah.
And I have been trying to resurrect Karen Horney and show some love to the amazing work that she's done on the neurotic trends. I don't know if you're familiar with that idea of hers. It's beautiful. And yeah, so as a psychoanalyst, do you think there's still a place in the modern day world for psychoanalysis? We don't need to move completely on from that.
Oh my
Yeah.
gosh. I
Yeah.
mean, it's really, I run the psychodynamic teaching program at the residency at my hospital, at Massachusetts General Hospital and McLean Hospital. And it is a teaching program that basically teaches people to talk and listen rather than pulling out a manual. It teaches them, okay, how do you listen between the lines? How do you listen to what someone's not able to tell you? But you can get hints of it. How do you listen to their train of thought and from that draw some inferences about what's most worrying them or what's most upsetting them? And then how can you reflect it back to them so that they feel heard, they feel understood? And that's very different from taking out a manual and say, today we're going to work on these 4 dysfunctional beliefs. CBT has a lot of usefulness, don't get me wrong, but this kind of more open-ended exploratory model of psychotherapy, I find just incredibly powerful. And the research says it's just as powerful as CBT. CBT says it's the only evidence-based practice, but that's not true.
Oh, and boy. You're like, those are fighting words.
They are fighting words, but the studies show that psychodynamic work is as effective and in some studies longer lasting than the results of CBT for depression, for anxiety, for a whole variety of problems.
Well, I know some CBT people where that would be fighting words, what you just said. But yeah, because they do kind of have this attitude that there's no evidence base. There's no evidence base,
and that's so not true. I know the evidence base well, actually, because I've had to look into it and amass a lot of the papers about it.
Well, do you feel like the close cousin of depth psychology, which is of a psychoanalytic therapy, which I think is depth therapy? Do you think that's underrated? Because I think depth therapy, that Carl Jung's ideas about what therapy looked like, his vision for therapy, I think that's really underrated too these days. Do you agree?
I do too. I do too. I think he had, Freud wasn't an easy guy, right? And he had terrible rivalries with Jung. And
Let's be honest. Yeah.
So, so a lot of Freudians and Jungians kind of don't talk to each other, which is, of course, silly. But Jung had some very important ideas and really expanded on what Freud did in important ways.
I think so as well. And then, humanistic psychology doesn't get as much love as it should, in my opinion. Existential humanistic psychology.
Yeah.
Carl Rogers and all
Irvin
that.
Yalom. Yeah.
Yeah. He's been on my podcast.
Has he?
He has. Yes. Recently.
Really?
Yeah, I'll send you the episode. He's a legend.
I love stuff. I really do.
Have you met him?
I was at a conference where he spoke, but I've never met him.
He's such a great guy. His work has influenced me a lot. Okay, so I know we've strayed a little bit away from the details of your study, but I just wanted to go into this realm of what sort of therapies do you think are underrated in this day and age. Let's tie it back to your study. So do you view some of the major findings through a lens of psychodynamics? I'm just curious. And then obviously tell us some of the biggest findings. I know you've spoken this on many podcasts, but for our audience who maybe are not as aware of some of the most significant findings, please tell me them. And then how do you interpret them? Through what lens? Yeah.
Sure. I would say that the interpretation, that really what we do is we think of questions to ask that are informed in part by psychodynamic, psychoanalytic theory. So we've studied security of attachment in our older adults and their partners. So we studied late life marriage and security of attachment in late life marriage.
Nice. Amazing.
And its links with brain functioning, all kinds of things. So my interest in psychodynamics informs the kinds of things I study and measure in the longitudinal study. And then there was another part. You asked me.
Go through some of the most significant, findings. Yeah.
So probably the biggest takeaway and the biggest surprise from this study was that the people who had the warmest connections with other people weren't just happier, but they stayed healthier, right? That was the surprise. Like, how could relationships get into your body? And how could warm relationships make it less likely that you'd get coronary artery disease or type 2 diabetes, right? Like, how could that be a thing? And then a lot of other studies began to find the same thing, and we came to understand that this is a robust finding. So we've been studying the mechanisms.
What do you think okay, in terms of the measures you're referring to, give me a specific dependent measure from the psychological perspective. What sort of tests do you use?
Tests of
whatever you're measuring psychologically. I just I don't have a list of all the sort of tests that you've administered, because it's like, because I'm trying to wrap my head around how this is something I'm trying to wrap my head around. And please explain to me. In 1938, when it was initiated, it's not like you had very well psychometric validated tests that you have today. So how are you able to look at continuity over these different time periods when a lot of these tests are recently developed? So that's one thing I'm trying to understand.
That's a great question. So you're right. So my predecessors asked about the same things, but they asked different questions. The wording of the questions was different. So then how do you compare the data you get in response to one question from the data you get 50 years later in response to a different question?
That's my
about
question.
Marriage, for example, or happiness, whatever. So one of the things that you can do is to look at what are called latent constructs. Yeah. So let's say we ask about marriage in 5 different ways over 40 years, right? But you can see, okay, what's the latent construct, the underlying thing we're trying to measure each time we ask the question. And then there are statistical methods for converting the data you get in response to each different question into something that's comparable, where you kind of put them on a level playing field. And so what you do is you identify a latent construct and you then harmonize different measures so that then you've got, it's not exactly repeated measures, but it's measures of roughly the same thing over time. So that's what we do. And there are some very well-developed techniques for doing that now.
Absolutely. No, that makes complete sense to me. I didn't even know you did that. So it's, you can swim in the sea of latent variable analysis and even you could test some of the older items from the 30s now and see how it loads on the factor of the new factor. So I get it now. I mean, I had so many of these unanswered questions that I don't get from your other interviews because they're with like people who don't know anything about psychology. So I'm left with the more detail oriented questions. So, okay, now I get it. That's really cool.
I'm delighted. It's great to get to talk to you about this because nobody else asked.
That's what we do here on this show. That's what we do here. Okay, that's cool. And so do find that some of the kinds of questions they asked that maybe like are outdated in terms of like, maybe not even politically correct, like maybe it focused on the male gender, right? Because and stuff. Do you find it still loads on some more global factors when you include other kinds of items that are more modern day?
Yeah, you can. You can see that, actually this loads really well. This coheres really well with some of the other measures, some of the other questions we asked. Sometimes it's surprising how well they cohere and surprising how well they predict things. So actually, George Vaillant measured defense mechanisms, and he did it in this really creative way. He identified vignettes, stories people told about a challenging time, a relationship or a job challenge or something. He'd take those stories and have people code them and say, okay, what defense mechanisms were being used here? And then we have a kind of measure of what is someone's primary motive defending themselves against challenge, against anxiety? What are their top 2 defense mechanisms? And then what we find is that the maturity of their defenses, how mature they are, is so predictive of so many things later on. And so this kind of rough and ready measure that we created by coding text, by coding stories, turns out to be hugely predictive of health, of well-being, of work functioning, right?
Wow.
So it's pretty cool. Yeah.
Hey everyone, I'd like to take a moment to talk about one of my favorite products that helps supports my mind and energy. On the Psychology Podcast, we often highlight different forms of mind-body connection, and nootropics are a powerful example. Nutritional science supporting or not supporting brain health can have a lot to do with our drive to accomplish, the richness of our experiences, and the thriving presence from peak mental wellness. Neurohacker Collective is a science team founded in 2015 that has advanced the frontier of nutritionally supporting brain health. Personally, I've known the folks at Neurohacker Collective for years now, and they really are thoughtful about what they put into their products, always trying to be as science-informed as possible. They were specifically founded with a neuroscience specialty in the field of supplementation, and Qualia Mind is that effort. Qualia Mind blends 28 of the most research-backed nootropics on Earth into the most comprehensive formula to support short and long-term brain health, promote mental energy, and get things done on a daily basis from a place of thriving. Qualia Mind is vegan, non-GMO, gluten-free, and backed by a 100-day money-back guarantee. Qualia Mind's impact on my own mindset, productivity, energy, and inspiration have been really profound. To try Qualia Mind up to 50% off, go to neurohacker.com/psychology and enter code psychology at checkout for an additional 15% off. That's Qualia Mind, code psychology at neurohacker.com/psychology for an additional 15% off. I'm obsessed with modern day measurement of defense mechanisms. It's been a hobby of mine. I want to send you a paper where we try to do a big factor analysis of all different kind of defense mechanism items from different scales to kind of see what the essential features are. I'm just trying to Google my paper right now because I'll tell you some of the major factors, and then I want to know how it maps onto which factors you found are most important for. You said two. There's two biggies. So I want to keep the drum roll going for a second. Dun, dun, dun.
You mean for defenses or for?
Did you say you found top two defense mechanisms? Did I understand that correctly?
Oh, no. I was giving an example, like what are this person's. But we did find what my co-author, Marc Schulz, and I reorganized George's defense mechanism ratings into two big categories, which were defenses that engaged the world and defenses that avoided the world, avoided reality. So it was avoidance versus engagement. And what we found was that people who were higher on the engagement dimension were much more successful in their lives than the people who were higher on the avoidance dimension.
Wait, that's huge. That's a huge finding. Huge finding.
There's a paper called Facing the Music or Burying Our Heads in the Sand. That's the title of the paper.
Oh my God. I got to chill because I love that finding. I've been really fascinated with the research in the ACT approach on experiential avoidance and how that underlies so many forms of psychopathology. And so that I want to find that paper. That is really in line with a lot of other research. So you found those two categories, engagement and avoidance. So we found four factors. Let me just read the factors to you. We administered so many of these defense items. And these are the four factors. One was maladaptive action patterns, is what we labeled this. Obviously, with it's subjective what you label a factor, but that's what we labeled it. And they were the kind of items like they included suppression. I'm unable to keep a problem out of my mind until I have a time to deal with it. Rationalization, like I'm unable to find good reasons for everything I do, or I'm unable to keep a problem out of my mind. I'm reverse coding it on the spot. I'm often told I don't show my feelings. So that actually seems to have to do with avoidance. Yeah. I think that maladaptive action patterns. I actually, as I'm reading these items, I'm like, that seems to be avoidance, suppression. The second one we found was an image distortion factor, which tended to have to do with changing oneself. I'm the greatest. That was a very narcissistic sort of, ways of dealing. I ignore dangers if I were Superman. Sometimes I think I'm an angel, and other times I think I'm a devil. Something to do with distortion of one's self-image.
Yeah.
Third, we found were adaptive, very adaptive ones, like like using humor, using creativity, anticipation, and then a fourth one was more altruism. So I feel good when I know someone, when I know, I always feel that someone I know is like a guardian angel. If I were in a crisis, I would seek out another person who had the same problem. So ways of dealing and coping through altruism. Anyway, that was our 4 factors. I was just my nerdy question is, do you see any of those 4 playing a role in what you found?
Well, we do. It's a different way to, you're
I
using
know.
buckets, but it's the same coping mechanisms, right? And
Yeah,
so like it's just and as you know, there's no standard list of defense mechanisms, right?
I
Because
know.
you can label it so many ways. And so what you're trying to get at is 4 dimensions. We had divided things into 2 dimensions, but we're all looking at the same
I know.
styles of coping. And so I'd love to see what you did. That would be great.
We correlated it with narcissism and
Mm.
things. Okay, well this is wonderful. And how do those findings, avoidance approach, how does it link to the oft cited finding about the importance of human connection? How do you can you relate those things to each other at all? Like, do people who have
Yeah,
more avoidance, do they avoid relationships that would be beneficial for them? That sort of thing.
right.
Yeah.
And they often avoid dealing with problems in relationships,
Oh,
right?
yeah. There you go. Attachment style. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So we find that avoidance doesn't work well interpersonally, right? It
Mm.
also doesn't work well in other things too, like dealing with a health crisis, right?
Yeah.
But certainly interpersonally, not a good, not a good thing.
Why do you emphasize connection so much in when you talk about this? I mean, your awesome TED Talk emphasized connection. The book does a lot. Is that like the thing you're most excited about finding consistently, or I'm just
Well,
curious.
because the findings are so powerful,
That's
right?
the most
It's
powerful
like,
finding.
yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
also taking care of your health,
Yeah.
which matters hugely. So, but I think what we have found is that the benefits of connection and the hazards of loneliness and disconnection are so powerful that the reason why we're excited about it is we feel like we really want to bring this message to people.
Yeah. Yeah.
That in some ways, it's not rocket science. In some ways, it's stating something that we all deep down know, but it's just bringing it out front and center and saying, look, there's all this science behind it.
It's so important, and there is so much science behind it. For everyone, that almost every study you find, you tend to find loneliness predicts a lot of negative, maladaptive things in life. Again, I just want to come back to the control question, the control group question. What would that even, in this kind of study, what would that even look like? Like, obviously the 2 groups, the Harvard group and the juvenile group, are very different from each other. Do you compare them to each other ever? Okay, so you can do
Absolutely.
cross sample comparisons? Okay.
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay. That's great. What are some
Yeah.
findings? What are some findings from looking at the benefits? Because there's got to be benefits of going to Harvard and having that social support system, having people believe in you, versus going through and having people kind of expect, negative outcomes.
Yeah. And actually the most powerful finding we have on that regard, comparing them, is that the Harvard guys live on average 10 years longer than the inner city guys.
Wow.
So privilege
Wow.
matters a lot.
Yeah.
But 25 of the inner city guys, 25 out of 456, went to college and graduated from college. And those 25 lived just as long on average as the Harvard guys. So what we find is, and we don't think it's because of their college diplomas, but we think that the the support they got, first of all, to get to college and to stay in college, that was huge and probably had other effects on their lives and their longevity. And then also the education, the value of the education, because, the big public health messages about the dangers of smoking, the dangers of addiction, of alcoholism, all that really began to emerge in the 60s, 70s, 80s, come into the public health consciousness. And we think that the Harvard guys, because of their education and reading more widely, probably got those messages sooner and were able to implement them sooner than the inner city guys. So we think that education probably had something to do with this longevity benefit.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. A lot of obviously most of the participants it's anonymous. We don't know who they are, but it was leaked, that JFK was one of the study participants. And so you have in some closet somewhere, you have a lot of information about JFK and things we probably don't even know, about him that, and his life. So I'm not going to ask you to tell me any secrets, but tell me some secrets.
Yeah, well, of course, and I couldn't tell you.
I know, but tell me. Yeah.
We don't have the information about JFK. So when he was running for Senate from the state of Massachusetts, his advisors thought it was best that he withdraw from the study.
Oh, I see.
And that they remove his records, because they felt that having a bunch of private personal information in an office somewhere, even though it was locked up, probably wasn't a good idea. So those records are now in the Kennedy Library.
Oh, I see. Okay.
At the University of Massachusetts.
Okay. I see. And that's open to the public?
Yeah. You can go look.
I see. I didn't know that. That's cool. Well, so there are a lot of successful individuals in the Harvard thing. What about the inner city guys? I like how you refer to them as the inner city guys, so I'm going to refer to them as that as well.
Yeah.
Anyone there, you don't have to give me names, obviously, but anyone who became wildly successful from that cohort?
Yes, there were. There were people who became, business owners, quite successful, maybe millionaires. At a time when $1 million was a huge amount of money, that kind of thing. So some of them, I think one had a shop that made the first Toll House chocolate chip cookies, very cool. Now, I will tell you the opposite of the success story, which I only found out when it was published in the Boston Globe, that in the delinquent sample, which we did not follow, the delinquent boys from that study, one of them was the Boston Strangler.
Wow. We're allowed to know that?
We're allowed to know that because it was published in the Boston Globe not that long ago.
Wow. Well, I don't know what lessons to learn about happiness from him. Was he, because what if you found out that he was the Boston Strangler, but he was happy, what lesson do we learn from that? No lesson. So,
well, we didn't didn't follow him.
You didn't follow it up. You didn't follow that up. Yeah, no, I know that's I know that got dark really quick, but I'm just, my point here is that, the point I'm trying to make is that, I often feel like when we talk about happiness, I always try to emphasize to people, it's how you acquire that happiness that matters, sometimes even more. Eric Fromm has this wonderful book called The Sane Society, which is one of my favorite books. And I think it's so important to recognize that being sane in an insane society is actually a marker of insanity. Being happy if everyone else around you is dying or suffering, do we just want to reward and say, look, let's do whatever this person's doing because they're happy? No, so just zooming out to a broader context and not just looking at the factors that predict happiness, but look to see that those factors are increasing the net positive on the world, I think is important too. Do you agree? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
The Boston Strangler is just an example of that. I was like, because it's that'd be cheeky, not cheeky, but you find, well, it turns out the Boston Strangler scores were the happiest of them all. Well, it's not like we then want to do whatever he did. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we know that sociopaths are often impervious to what other people think of them, whatever, and so they seem untouchable in terms of their happiness.
Yeah. I am so excited to announce that registrations are now open for our self-actualization coaching intensive. While the coaching industry has taken great strides over the years toward integrating more evidence-based coaching approaches, there is still a lot of work to be done. Many coach training programs still lack strong foundations in science and do little to incorporate research-informed tools, methodologies, or approaches for helping clients thrive. For 20 years, I've dedicated my career to rigorously testing ways to unlock creativity, intelligence, and our potential as human beings. Now, for the first time ever, I have compiled some of my greatest insights to bring the new science of self-actualization to the field of professional coaching. This immersive 3-day learning experience will introduce you to self-actualization coaching, an approach intended to enhance your coaching practice by offering you evidence-based tools and insights from my research that will equip you to more effectively help your clients unlock their unique potential. Don't miss out on this unique opportunity. Join us and take your coaching practice to the next level. Go to sacoaching.org. That's sacoaching.org. I look forward to welcoming you in December. In terms of like relationship, the power, because I'm right there with you on the power of relationships. And I love that you're bringing that so foremost to the culture. Your work has done a lot to bring that to the foremost. I love that. There's obviously a lot of nuance there, like being single, like in terms of romantic relationships. Do you find, like, I feel like a good marriage is like one of the best, if not the best predictors of happiness, but a bad marriage is one of the best predictors of depression. So yeah. It's not just like get married. It's like, no, get married to the right person, and
figure out how to work on relationships to make them better. Now, not every relationship is workable. And so, as we know, many people split up, and some couples really should split up. Some friendships should split up. Yeah. But I think one of the things we try to emphasize in the book is that it's really important to see what's possible in a relationship, to see if it's possible to work through difficulties, because often it makes a relationship stronger. And once you've invested in a relationship, whether it's a romantic relationship or a friendship, there's huge cost to blowing it off, to jettisoning it. So we want to be sure that we've done what we can to see if differences can be worked out.
Oh, I completely agree with that. I'm writing down some of this stuff because I feel like you're giving me good quotes for my next book. No, I think you're saying, yeah, you're absolutely, yeah. And of course I'm going to ask your permission before I include it in my book. But
absolutely. I'll give you my permission.
you're giving me good, you're saying such good things that I really agree with. Just getting back to the nitty-gritty details of what you're looking at, do you have measures of meaning? Do you have because like modern day well-being scales exist, right? That incorporate lots of different things. Purpose. Do you feel like a sense of purpose, a sense of meaning in your life? Do you feel like you matter? Or do you feel like you're not just connection, but other things? I'm wondering, are you using any of these modern day scales? And
we do. Like we use Ed Diener's satisfaction with life scale. Okay. We use some more expanded satisfaction with life scales, and they include questions like, do you feel like you have meaning and purpose, or what gets you up, and do you know what gets you up in the morning, and that kind of thing. So we do, and we use those scales because they are tested, they are tried and true. George Valiant and his predecessors made up a lot of their own questions, and they were great at it. It's just that they didn't do psychometric testing on them. And so now what we've done is to bring in measures that have been tested, and that way it allows us to compare our data to other studies that are using the same measures.
Absolutely. Because do you ever find that some things that predict happiness maybe don't predict meaning, and vice versa? Something like when I say happiness, I mean just life satisfaction. Scale 1 to 10, how satisfied with you are your life? What's the ratio of your positive to your negative emotions? That's really just how the life satisfaction questionnaire is. But do you find there's some things that over the years have predicted a greater sense of meaning and purpose, but may show lower happiness scores? Do you look at that differentiation at all?
We don't, but I think you probably know of Carol Riff's work where she
Absolutely.
differentiates,
Yeah.
hedonic well-being from
Yeah.
eudaimonic well-being.
Love
And
her
we
work.
know, there are people who prioritize meaning and purpose, and they'll defer gratification in order to get that. And there are other people who say, no, I really want to party now and I want to have a good time right now. And so we know that people differ a lot in the extent to which they prioritize the being happy now versus the deferred gratification kind of happiness.
Yeah. Yeah. I was just curious if you looked at that differentiation at all. And then, of course, the creativity question's so interesting to me. Success. Have you looked at like the role of self-esteem or the role of feeling like you are competent in your life, and how much that matters? Have you looked at that at all?
Well, we haven't, I would say we have not done really rigorous measurement of self-esteem. I wish we had, because it's something that I feel is so vital.
Yeah.
We haven't done that, but we know people would mention things that reflected high or low self-esteem a lot in their responses to us. But have we done a particular defined study of self-esteem? No.
It's fair enough. I mean, you can't measure everything in the world.
We wish, when people like you ask really good questions, with like, oh, I wish we had asked that.
Well, look, I mean, it's still one of the best, most unique studies in the history of psychology. Don't feel, apologetic at all that you didn't, we didn't include every possible measure in the world. The original architects of the study, did they ever plan for this to be a longitudinal study, or it just turned out to be that way?
Well, no, I think they planned to follow people maybe 5 to 10 years.
Okay.
But nobody ever dreamed it would go on this long.
It's a really remarkable achievement, and that you're part of a remarkable lineage.
Yeah, I feel really lucky.
Yeah. Well, you're worthy. But yeah. That's the psychologist in me.
Yeah, exactly.
So, with the connection thing, what are tell me some more of the benefits of connection that you found? People who were able to have more connection, otherwise were also able to what in their lives? Like what tell me more of the correlations or associations you see there.
Well, they weathered hard times better, right? Because relationships help us get through the hard times. They were often more successful at work. And, we know this from lots of work now that says, emotional intelligence, people skills, being good with people often matters more than IQ for how well you do at work. So there are a lot of things we found about connection. It has a lot of positive benefits and a lot of benefits in terms of weathering the storms of life. And
remind me how you measured the presence of high quality connections. That's a phrase, in the psychological literature, high quality connections, which is different than like the need for belonging. You can feel a sense of belonging, but not feel like there's a mutual, intimate back and forth. So I'm just curious, how do you measure the presence of lots of high quality connections in one's life?
Well, so in different ways. I mean, we'd ask people about friends. How often do you see friends? What do you do with your friends?
I see.
That kind of thing. And we would also talk about being satisfied. How satisfied are you with friends? How satisfied are you with your spouse? How good is your sex life? I mean, there were a lot of things we asked that tried to get at quality.
That's great. It's pretty comprehensive.
Yeah.
Well, I feel like I've, don't worry, I think I've exhausted my questions for today. I look at you every time I start to ask a question, I think you feel like you're in the hot seat or something, like, and where were you on June 2nd, 1972? But I really honor and treasure this opportunity to be able to ask you those questions. I've wondered them for a while, and I hope our listeners really get the main points of this study. They don't get lost in the factor analysis discussion, but they understand the main points here. Any other sort of main sort of points you want to make about what you've gleaned from this enormous data set?
Well, I think that, we talk about what we've called social fitness, and it's really just an analogy with physical fitness, the idea that the people in our study who were best at this were the people who were active, who would make sure they stayed in touch with friends, who would make plans with friends, who were proactive, who didn't just wait for relationships to take care of themselves, because they didn't always take care of themselves. Some really good relationships would just wither away and die. And so I think that's an important message that's worth getting out there.
Yeah, that's a beautiful place to maybe end. As
Yeah.
I get older, I feel like I hold on, more tightly to my most meaningful relationships. Trying to make it's investment. You make investments easy. Calling mom, staying in touch more regularly, calling your friend who's on another coast or whatever, and these are
Right.
investments. And your research shows in a lot of ways that these individuals who made these investments as young as possible, it lived longer, and lots of really great things. Dr. Waldinger, such an honor to have you on my podcast today, and I wish you all the best with the continuing studies of it.
Great. This was a pleasure. I really enjoyed talking with you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Psychology Podcast. If you'd like to react in some way to something you heard, I encourage you to join in the discussion at thepsychologypodcast.com or on our YouTube page, The Psychology Podcast. We also put up some videos of some episodes on our YouTube page as well, so you'll want to check that out. Thanks for being such a great supporter of the show, and tune in next time for more on the mind, brain, behavior, and creativity.